19. Christian Apologetics. This was read to the Anglican Carmarthen Conference for Youth Leaders and Junior Clergy at Easter 1945. It was subsequently published in Undeceptions 1971 and later in Compelling Reason 1998. Some of you are priests and some are leaders of youth organizations. I have little right to address either. It is for priests to teach me, not for me to teach them. I have never helped to organize youth, and while I was young myself, I successfully avoided being organized. If I address you, it is in response to a request so urged that I came to regard compliance as a matter of obedience. I am to talk about apologetics. Apologetics means, of course, defense. The first question is, what do you propose to defend? Christianity, of course, and Christianity as understood by the Church in Wales. And here at the outset I must deal with an unpleasant business. It seems to the layman that in the Church of England we often hear from our priests doctrine which is not Anglican Christianity. It may depart from Anglican Christianity in either of two ways. One, it may be so broad or liberal or modern that it in fact excludes any real supernaturalism and thus ceases to be Christian at all. 2. It may, on the other hand, be Roman. It is not, of course, for me to define to you what Anglican Christianity is. I am your pupil, not your teacher. But I insist that wherever you draw the lines, bounding lines must exist, beyond which your doctrine will cease either to be Anglican or to be Christian. And I suggest also that the lines come a great deal sooner than many modern priests think. I think it is your duty to fix the lines clearly in your own minds, and if you wish to go beyond them, you must change your profession. This is your duty not specially as Christians or as priests, but as honest men. There is a danger here of the clergy developing a special professional conscience which obscures the very plain moral issue. Men who have passed beyond these boundary lines in either direction are apt to protest that they have come by their unorthodox opinions honestly. In defense of these opinions, they are prepared to suffer obloquy and to forfeit professional advancement. They thus come to feel like martyrs. But this simply misses the point which so gravely scandalizes the layman. We never doubted that the unorthodox opinions were honestly held. What we complain of is your continuing your ministry after you have come to hold them. We always knew that a man who makes his living as a paid agent of the Conservative Party may honestly change his views and honestly become a communist. What we deny is that he can honestly continue to be a Conservative agent and to receive money from one party while he supports the policy of another. Even when we have thus ruled out teaching which is in direct contradiction to our profession, we must define our task still further. We are to defend Christianity itself, the faith preached by the apostles, attested by the martyrs, embodied in the creeds, expounded by the fathers. This must be clearly distinguished from the whole of what any one of us may think about God and man. Each of us has his individual emphasis. Each holds, in addition to the faith, many opinions which seem to him to be consistent with it and true and important. And so perhaps they are. But as apologists, it is not our business to defend them. We are defending Christianity, not my religion. When we mention our personal opinions, we must always make quite clear the difference between them and the faith itself. St. Paul has given us the model in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 25. On a certain point he has no commandment of the Lord, but gives his judgment. No one is left in doubt as to the difference in status implied. This distinction, which is demanded by honesty, also gives the apologist a great tactical advantage. The great difficulty is to get modern audiences to realize that you are preaching Christianity solely and simply because you happen to think it true. They always suppose you are preaching it because you like it, or think it good for society, or something of that sort. Now, a clearly maintained distinction between what the faith actually says and what you would like it to have said, or what you understand, or what you personally find helpful or think probable, forces your audience to realize that you are tied to your data just as the scientist is tied by the results of the experiments, that you are not just saying what you like. This immediately helps them to realize that what is being discussed is a question about objective fact, not gas about ideals and points of view. Secondly, this scrupulous care to preserve the Christian message as something distinct from one's own ideas has one very good effect upon the apologist himself. It forces him, again and again, to face up to those elements in original Christianity which he personally finds obscure or repulsive. He is saved from the temptation to skip or slur or ignore what he finds disagreeable. And the man who yields to that temptation will, of course, never progress in Christian knowledge. For obviously, the doctrines which one finds easy are the doctrines which give Christian sanction to truths you already knew. The new truth, which you do not know and which you need, must, in the very nature of things, be hidden precisely in the doctrines you least like and least understand. It is just the same here as in science. The phenomenon which is troublesome, which doesn't fit in with the current scientific theories, is the phenomenon which compels reconsideration, and thus leads to new knowledge. Science progresses because scientists, instead of running away from such troublesome phenomena or hushing them up, are constantly seeking them out. In the same way, there will be progress in Christian knowledge only as long as we accept the challenge of the difficult or repellent doctrines. A liberal Christianity, which considers itself free to alter the faith whenever the faith looks perplexing or repellent, must be completely stagnant. Progress is made only into a resisting material. From this, there follows a corollary about the apologist's private reading. There are two questions he will naturally ask himself. 1. Have I been keeping abreast of recent movements in theology? 2. Have I stood firm, super monstratus vias, amidst all these winds of doctrine? Ephesians chapter 4, verse 14. I want to say emphatically that the second question is far the more important of the two. Our upbringing and the whole atmosphere of the world we live in make it certain that our main temptation will be that of yielding to winds of doctrine, not that of ignoring them. We are not at all likely to be hidebound. We are very likely indeed to be the slaves of fashion. If one has to choose between reading the new books and reading the old, one must choose the old. And not because they are necessarily better, but because they contain precisely those truths of which our own age is neglectful. The standard of permanent Christianity must be kept clear in our minds, and it is against that standard that we must test all contemporary thought. In fact, we must at all costs not move with the times. We serve one who said, "Heaven and earth shall move with the times, but my words shall not move with the times." Matthew chapter 24, verse 35, Mark chapter 13, verse 31, Luke chapter 21, verse 33. I am speaking so far of theological reading. Scientific reading is a different matter. If you know any science, it is very desirable that you should keep it up. We have to answer the current scientific attitude towards Christianity, not the attitude which scientists adopted 100 years ago. Science is in continual change, and we must try to keep abreast of it. For the same reason, we must be very cautious of snatching at any scientific theory which, for the moment, seems to be in our favour. We may mention such things, but we must mention them lightly and without claiming that they are more than interesting. Sentences beginning, "Science has now proved," should be avoided. If we try to base our apologetic on some recent development in science, we shall usually find that just as we have put the finishing touches to our argument, science has changed its mind and quietly withdrawn the theory we have been using as our foundation stone. Timeo Danaeus et dona ferentes is a sound principle. While we are on the subject of science, let me digress for a moment. I believe that any Christian who is qualified to write a good popular book on any science may do much more good by that than by any directly apologetic work. The difficulty we are up against is this. We can make people often attend to the Christian point of view for half an hour or so. But the moment they have gone away from our lecture or laid down our article, they are plunged back into a world where the opposite position is taken for granted. Every newspaper, film, novel, and textbook undermines our work. As long as that situation exists, widespread success is simply impossible. We must attack the enemy's line of communication. What we want is not more little books about Christianity, but more little books by Christians on other subjects, with their Christianity latent. You can see this most easily if you look at it the other way round. Our faith is not very likely to be shaken by any book on Hinduism. But if, whenever we read an elementary book on geology, botany, politics, or astronomy, we found that its implications were Hindu, that would shake us. It is not the books written in direct defense of materialism that make the modern man a materialist. It is the materialistic assumptions in all the other books. In the same way, it is not books on Christianity that will really trouble him. But he would be troubled if, whenever he wanted a cheap, popular introduction to some science, the best work on the market was always by a Christian. The first step to the reconversion of the country is a series produced by Christians which can beat the Penguins and the Thinkers' Library on their own ground. Its Christianity would have to be latent, not explicit, and, of course, its science perfectly honest. Science twisted in the interests of apologetics would be sin and folly. But I must return to my immediate subject. Our business is to present that which is timeless, the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, Hebrews chapter 8, verse 8, in the particular language of our own age. The bad preacher does exactly the opposite. He takes the ideas of our own age and tricks them out in the traditional language of Christianity. Thus, for example, he may think about the Beveridge Report and talk about the coming of the kingdom. The core of his thought is merely contemporary. Only the superficies is traditional. But your teaching must be timeless at its heart and wear a modern dress. This raises the question of theology and politics. The nearest I can get to a settlement of the frontier problem between them is this: that theology teaches us what ends are desirable and what means are lawful, while politics teaches us what means are effective. Thus theology tells us that every man ought to have a decent wage. Politics tells us by what means this is likely to be attained. Theology tells us which of these means are consistent with justice and charity. On the political question, guidance comes not from revelation, but from natural prudence, knowledge of complicated facts, and ripe experience. If we have these qualifications, we may, of course, state our political opinions. But then we must make it quite clear that we are giving our personal judgment and have no command from the Lord. Not many priests have these qualifications. Most political sermons teach the congregation nothing except what newspapers are taken at the rectory. Our great danger at present is lest the Church should continue to practice a merely missionary technique in what has become a missionary situation. A century ago, our task was to edify those who had been brought up in the faith. Our present task is chiefly to convert and instruct infidels. Great Britain is as much a part of the mission field as China. Now, if you were sent to the Bantus, you would be taught their language and traditions. You need similar teaching about the language and mental habits of your own uneducated and unbelieving fellow countrymen. Many priests are quite ignorant on this subject. What I know about it, I have learned from talking in RAF camps. They were mostly inhabited by Englishmen, and, therefore, some of what I shall say may be irrelevant to the situation in Wales. You will sift out what does not apply. 1. I find that the uneducated Englishman is an almost total skeptic about history. I had expected he would disbelieve the Gospels because they contain miracles, but he really disbelieves them because they deal with things that happened 2,000 years ago. He would disbelieve equally in the Battle of Actium if he heard of it. To those who have had our kind of education, his state of mind is very difficult to realize. To us, the present has always appeared as one section in a huge continuous process. In his mind, the present occupies almost the whole field of vision. Beyond it, isolated from it, and quite unimportant, is something called the old days, a small comic jungle in which highwaymen, Queen Elizabeth, knights in armour, etc. wander about. Then, strangest of all, beyond the old days comes a picture of primitive man. He is science, not history, and is therefore felt to be much more real than the old days. In other words, the prehistoric is much more believed in than the historic. 2. He has a distrust, very rational in the state of his knowledge, of ancient texts. Thus a man has sometimes said to me, "These records were written in the days before printing, weren't they? And you haven't got the original bit of paper, have you?" So what it comes to is that someone wrote something, and someone else copied it, and someone else copied that, and so on. Well, by the time it comes to us, it won't be in the least like the original. This is a difficult objection to deal with, because one cannot, there and then, start teaching the whole science of textual criticism. But at this point their real religion, i.e. faith in science, has come to my aid. The assurance that there is a science called textual criticism, and that its results, not only as regards the New Testament, but as regards ancient texts in general, are generally accepted, will usually be received without objection. I need hardly point out that the word text must not be used, since to your audience it means only a scriptural quotation. 3. A sense of sin is almost totally lacking. Our situation is thus very different from that of the apostles. The pagans, and still more the Metuentes, to whom they preached, were haunted by a sense of guilt, and to them the gospel was, therefore, good news. We address people who have been trained to believe that whatever goes wrong in the world is someone else's fault. The capitalists, the governments, the Nazis, the generals, etc. They approach God himself as his judges. They want to know not whether they can be acquitted for sin, but whether he can be acquitted for creating such a world. In attacking this fatal insensibility, it is useless to direct attention, A, to sins your audience do not commit, or B, to things they do but do not regard as sins. They are usually not drunkards. They are mostly fornicators, but then they do not feel fornication to be wrong. It is, therefore, useless to dwell on either of these subjects. Now that contraceptives have removed the obviously uncharitable element in fornication, I do not myself think we can expect people to recognize it as a sin until they have accepted Christianity as a whole. I cannot offer you a watertight technique for awaking the sense of sin. I can only say that, in my experience, if one begins from the sin that has been one's own chief problem during the last week, one is very often surprised at the way this shaft goes home. But whatever method we use, our continual effort must be to get their minds away from public affairs and crime and bring them down to brass tacks, to the whole network of spite, greed, envy, unfairness, and conceit in the lives of ordinary, decent people like themselves and ourselves. 4. We must learn the language of our audience. And let me say at the outset that it is no use at all laying down a priori what the plain man does or does not understand. You have to find out by experience. Thus, most of us would have supposed that the change from "may truly and indifferently minister justice" to "may truly and impartially" made that place easier to the uneducated. But a priest of my acquaintance discovered his sexton saw no difficulty in "indifferently." "It means making no difference between one man and another," he said, but had no idea what "impartially" meant. On this question of language, the best thing I can do is to make a list of words which are used by people in a sense different from ours. Atonement does not really exist in a spoken modern English, though it would be recognized as a religious word. Insofar as it conveys any meaning to the uneducated, I think it means compensation. No one word will express to them what Christians mean by atonement. You must paraphrase. Being, noun, never means merely entity in popular speech. Often it means what we should call a personal being. E.g., a man said to me, "I believe in the Holy Ghost, but I don't think he is a being." Catholic means papistical. Charity means A. alms, B. a charitable organization, C. much more rarely, indulgence, i.e., a charitable attitude towards a man is conceived as one that denies or condones his sins, not as one that loves the sinner in spite of them. Christian has come to include almost no idea of belief, usually a vague term of approval. The question, "What do you call a Christian?" has been asked of me again and again. The answer they wish to receive is, A Christian is a decent chap who's unselfish, etc. Church means A. Sacred building, B. The clergy. Does not suggest to them the company of all faithful people. Generally used in a bad sense. Direct defence of the church is part of our duty, but use of the word church, where there is no time to defend it, alienates sympathy and should be avoided where possible. Creative now means merely talented, original. The idea of creation in the theological sense is absent from their minds. Creature means beast, irrational animal. Such an expression as, "we are only creatures," would almost certainly be misunderstood. Crucifixion, cross, etc. Centuries of hymnody and religious cant have so exhausted these words that they now very faintly, if at all, convey the idea of execution by torture. It is better to paraphrase, and, for the same reason, to say flogged, for New Testament scourged. Matthew chapter 27, verse 26, Mark chapter 15, verse 15, John chapter 19, verse 1. Dogma, used by the people only in a bad sense to mean unproved assertion delivered in an arrogant manner. Immaculate conception, in the mouth of an uneducated speaker, always means virgin birth. Morality means chastity. Personal. I had argued for at least 10 minutes with a man about the existence of a personal devil, before I discovered that personal meant to him corporeal. I suspect this of being widespread. When they say they don't believe in a personal God, they may often mean only that they are not anthropomorphists. Potential, when used at all, is used in an engineering sense. Never means possible. Primitive means crude, clumsy, unfinished, inefficient. Primitive Christianity would not mean to them at all what it does to you. Sacrifice has no associations with temple and altar. They are familiar with this word only in the journalistic sense. The nation must be prepared for heavy sacrifices. Spiritual means primarily immaterial, incorporeal, but with serious confusions from the Christian uses of pneuma. Hence the idea that whatever is spiritual, in the sense of non-sensuous, is somehow better than anything sensuous. E.g., they don't really believe that envy could be as bad as drunkenness. Vulgarity usually means obscenity or smut. There are bad confusions, and not only in uneducated minds, between A. the obscene or lascivious, what is calculated to provoke lust, B. the indecorous, what offends against good taste or propriety, C. the vulgar proper, what is socially low. Good people tend to think B as sinful as A, with the result that others feel A to be just as innocent as B. To conclude, you must translate every bit of your theology into the vernacular. This is very troublesome, and it means you can say very little in half an hour, but it is essential. It is also of the greatest service to your own thought. I have come to the conviction that if you cannot translate your thoughts into uneducated language, then your thoughts were confused. Power to translate is the test of having really understood one's own meaning. A passage from some theological work for translation into the vernacular ought to be a compulsory paper in every ordination examination. I turn now to the question of the actual attack. This may be either emotional or intellectual. If I speak only of the intellectual kind, that is not because I undervalue the other, because, not having been given the gifts necessary for carrying it out, I cannot give advice about it. But I wish to say most emphatically that where a speaker has that gift, the direct evangelical appeal of the "come to Jesus" type can be as overwhelming today as it was 100 years ago. I have seen it done, preluded by a religious film and accompanied by hymn singing, and with very remarkable effect. I cannot do it, but those who can ought to do it with all their might. I am not sure that the ideal missionary team ought not to consist of one who argues and one who, in the fullest sense of the word, preaches. Put up your arguer first to undermine their intellectual prejudices, then let the evangelist proper launch his appeal. I have seen this done with great success. But here I must concern myself only with the intellectual attack. non omnia possumus omnes. And first, a word of encouragement. Uneducated people are not irrational people. I have found that they will endure and can follow quite a lot of sustained argument if you go slowly. Often, indeed, the novelty of it, for they have seldom met it before, delights them. Do not attempt to water Christianity down. There must be no pretense that you can have it with the supernatural left out. So far as I can see, Christianity is precisely the one religion from which the miraculous cannot be separated. You must frankly argue for supernaturalism from the very outset. The two popular difficulties you will probably have to deal with are these. 1. Now that we know how huge the universe is and how insignificant the earth, it is ridiculous to believe that the universal God should be specially interested in our concerns. In answer to this, you must first correct their error about fact. The insignificance of Earth in relation to the universe is not a modern discovery. Nearly 2,000 years ago, Ptolemy, Almagest, Book 1, Chapter 5, said that in relation to the distance of the fixed stars, Earth must be treated as a mathematical point without magnitude. Secondly, you should point out that Christianity says what God has done for man. It doesn't say, because it doesn't know, what he has or has not done in other parts of the universe. Thirdly, you might recall the parable of the one lost sheep. Matthew chapter 18, verses 11 to 14, Luke chapter 15, verses 4 to 7. If Earth has been specially sought by God, which we don't know, that may not imply that it is the most important thing in the universe, but only that it has strayed. Finally, challenge the whole tendency to identify size and importance. Is an elephant more important than a man, or a man's leg than his brain? 2. People believed in miracles in the old days because they didn't know then that they were contrary to the laws of nature. But they did. If St. Joseph didn't know that a virgin birth was contrary to nature, i.e., if he didn't yet know the normal origin of babies, why, on discovering his wife's pregnancy, was he minded to put her away? Matthew chapter 1, verse 19. Obviously, no event would be recorded as a wonder unless the recorders knew the natural order and saw that this was an exception. If people didn't know that the sun rose in the east, they wouldn't even be interested in its once rising in the west. They would not record it as a miraculum, nor indeed record it at all. The very idea of miracle presupposes knowledge of the laws of nature. You can't have the idea of an exception until you have the idea of a rule. It is very difficult to produce arguments on the popular level for the existence of God, and many of the most popular arguments seem to me invalid. Some of these may be produced in discussion by friendly members of the audience. This raises the whole problem of the embarrassing supporter. It is brutal and dangerous to repel him. It is often dishonest to agree with what he says. I usually try to avoid saying anything about the validity of his argument in itself, and reply, "Yes, that may do for you and me, but I'm afraid if we take that line, our friend here on my left might say," etc., etc. Fortunately, though very oddly, I have found that people are usually disposed to hear the divinity of our Lord discussed before going into the existence of God. When I began, I used, if I were giving 2 lectures, to devote the first to mere theism, but I soon gave up this method because it seemed to arouse little interest. The number of clear and determined atheists is apparently not very large. When we come to the incarnation itself, I usually find that some form of the aut deus aut malus homo can be used. The majority of them started with the idea of the great human teacher, who was deified by his superstitious followers. It must be pointed out how very improbable this is among Jews, and how different to anything that happened with Plato, Confucius, Buddha, Muhammad. The Lord's own words and claims, of which many are quite ignorant, must be forced home. The whole case, on a popular level, is very well put indeed in Chesterton's Everlasting Man. Something will usually have to be said about the historicity of the Gospels. You who are trained theologians will be able to do this in ways which I could not. My own line was to say that I was a professional literary critic, and I thought I did know the difference between legend and historical writing. That the Gospels were certainly not legends. In one sense, they're not good enough. And that if they are not history, then they are realistic prose fiction of a kind which actually never existed before the 18th century. Little episodes such as Jesus writing in the dust, John chapter 8 verses 3 to 8, when they brought him the woman taken in adultery, which have no doctrinal significance at all, are the mark. One of the great difficulties is to keep before the audience's mind the question of truth. They always think you are recommending Christianity not because it is true, but because it is good. And in the discussion, they will at every moment try to escape from the issue, true or false, into stuff about a good society, or morals, or the incomes of bishops, or the Spanish Inquisition, or France, or Poland, or anything whatever. You have to keep forcing them back, and again back, to the real point. Only thus will you be able to undermine their belief that a certain amount of religion is desirable, but one mustn't carry it too far. One must keep on pointing out that Christianity is a statement which, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The one thing it cannot be is moderately important. B. Their firm belief of Article 18. Of course, it should be pointed out that, though all salvation is through Jesus, we need not conclude that he cannot save those who have not explicitly accepted him in this life. And it should, at least in my judgment, be made clear that we are not pronouncing all other religions to be totally false, but rather saying that in Christ whatever is true in all religions is consummated and perfected. But, on the other hand, I think we must attack, wherever we meet it, the nonsensical idea that mutually exclusive propositions about God can both be true. For my own part, I have sometimes told my audience that the only two things really worth considering are Christianity and Hinduism. Islam is only the greatest of the Christian heresies, Buddhism only the greatest of the Hindu heresies, real paganism is dead. All that was best in Judaism and Platonism survives in Christianity. There isn't really, for an adult mind, this infinite variety of religions to consider. We may, salva reverentia, divide religions as we do soups, into thick and clear. By thick, I mean those which have orgies and ecstasies and mysteries and local attachments. Africa is full of thick religions. By clear, I mean those which are philosophical, ethical, and universalizing. Stoicism, Buddhism, and the ethical church are clear religions. And now, if there is a true religion, it must be both thick and clear. For the true God must have made both the child and the man, both the savage and the citizen, both the head and the belly. And the only two religions that fulfill this condition are Hinduism and Christianity. But Hinduism fulfills it imperfectly. A clear religion of the Brahmin hermit in the jungle and the thick religion of the neighboring temple go on side by side. The Brahmin hermit doesn't bother about the temple prostitution, nor the worshipper in the temple about the hermit's metaphysic. But Christianity really breaks down the middle wall of the partition. It takes a convert from Central Africa and tells him to obey an enlightened universalist ethic. It takes a 20th century academic prig like me and tells me to go fasting to a mystery, to drink the blood of the Lord. The savage convert has to be clear, I have to be thick. That is how one knows one has come to the real religion. One last word. I have found that nothing is more dangerous to one's own faith than the work of an apologist. No doctrine of that faith seems to me so spectral, so unreal, as one that I have just successfully defended in a public debate. For a moment, you see, it has seemed to rest on oneself. As a result, when you go away from that debate, it seems no stronger than that weak pillar. That is why we apologists take our lives in our hands and can be saved only by falling back continually from the web of our own arguments, as from our intellectual counters, into the reality, from Christian apologetics into Christ himself. That also is why we need one another's continual help. Oremus pro invicem.
My dear Wormwood, Now that it is certain the German humans will bombard your patient's town, and that his duties will keep him in the thick of the danger, we must consider our policy. Are we to aim at cowardice, or at courage, with consequent pride, or at hatred of the Germans? Well, I'm afraid it is no good trying to make him brave. Our research department has not yet discovered, though success is hourly expected, how to produce any virtue. This is a serious handicap. To be greatly and effectively wicked, a man needs some virtue. What would Attila have been without his courage, or Shylock without self-denial as regards the flesh? But as we cannot supply these qualities ourselves, we can only use them as supplied by the enemy, and this means leaving him a kind of foothold in those men whom otherwise we have made most securely our own. A very unsatisfactory arrangement, but I trust we shall one day learn to do better. Hatred we can manage. The tension of human nerves during noise, danger, and fatigue makes them prone to any violent emotion, and it is only a question of guiding this susceptibility into the right channel. If conscience resists, muddle him. Let him say that he feels hatred not on his own behalf, but on that of the women and children, and that a Christian is told to forgive his own, not other people's enemies. In other words, let him consider himself sufficiently identified with the women and children to feel hatred on their behalf, but not sufficiently identified to regard their enemies as his own, and therefore proper objects of forgiveness. But hatred is best combined with fear. Cowardice, alone of all the vices, is purely painful, horrible to anticipate, horrible to feel, horrible to remember. Hatred has its pleasures. It is therefore often the compensation by which a frightened man reimburses himself for the miseries of fear. The more he fears, the more he will hate. And hatred is also a great anodyne for shame. To make a deep wound in his charity, you should therefore first defeat his courage. Now this is a ticklish business. We have made men proud of most vices, but not of cowardice. Whenever we have almost succeeded in doing so, the enemy permits a war or an earthquake or some other calamity, and at once courage becomes so obviously lovely and important, even in human eyes, that all our work is undone, and there is still at least one vice of which they feel genuine shame. The danger of inducing cowardice in our patients, therefore, is lest we produce real self-knowledge and self-loathing with consequent repentance and humility. And in fact, in the last war, thousands of humans, by discovering their own cowardice, discovered the whole moral world for the first time. In peace, we can make many of them ignore good and evil entirely. In danger, the issue is forced upon them in a guise to which even we cannot blind them. There is here a cruel dilemma before us. If we promoted justice and charity among men, we should be playing directly into the enemy's hands. But if we guide them to the opposite behavior, this sooner or later produces, for he permits it to produce, a war or a revolution, and the undisguisable issue of cowardice or courage awakes thousands of men from moral stupor. This indeed is probably one of the enemy's motives for creating a dangerous world, a world in which moral issues really come to the point. He sees as well as you do that courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at a testing point, which means at the point of highest reality. A chastity, or honesty, or mercy, which yields to danger, will be chaste, or honest, or merciful, only on conditions. Pilate was merciful till it became risky. It is therefore possible to lose as much as we gain by making your man a coward. He may learn too much about himself. There is, of course, always the chance, not of chloroforming the shame, but of aggravating it and producing despair. This would be a great triumph. It would show that he had believed in and accepted the enemy's forgiveness of his other sins only because he himself did not fully feel their sinfulness, that in respect of the one vice which he really understands, in its full depth of dishonor, he cannot seek nor credit the mercy. But I fear you have already let him get too far in the enemy's school, and he knows that despair is a greater sin than any of the sins which provoke it. As to the actual technique of temptations to cowardice, not much need be said. The main point is that precautions have a tendency to increase fear. The precautions publicly enjoined on your patient, however, soon become a matter of routine, and this effect disappears. What you must do is to keep running in his mind, side by side with the conscious intention of doing his duty, the vague idea of all sorts of things he can do or not do inside the framework of the duty, which seemed to make him a little suffer. Get his mind off the simple rule, I've got to stay here and do so and so, into a series of imaginary lifelines. If happened, though I very much hope it won't, I could do B, and if the worst came to the worst, I could always do C. Superstitions, if not recognized as such, can be awakened. The point is to keep him feeling that he has something other than the enemy and courage the enemy supplies to fall back on, so that what was intended to be a total commitment to duty becomes honeycombed all through with little unconscious reservation. By building up a series of imaginary expedients to prevent the worst coming to the worst, you may produce, at that level of his will which he's not aware of, a determination that the worst shall not come to the worst. Then, at the moment of real terror, rush it out into his nerves and muscles, and you may get the fatal act done before he knows what you're about. For remember, the act of cowardice is all that matters. The emotion of fear is, in itself, no sin, and though we enjoy it, does us no good. Your affectionate uncle. My dear Wormwood, I sometimes wonder whether you think you have been sent into the world for your own amusement. I gather, not from your miserably inadequate report, but from that of the infernal police, that the patient's behavior during the first raid has been the worst possible. He has been very frightened and thinks himself a great coward and therefore feels no pride. But he has done everything his duty demanded and perhaps a bit more. Against this disaster, all you can produce on the credit side is a burst of ill temper with a dog that tripped him up, some excessive cigarette smoking, and the forgetting of a prayer. What is the use of whining to me about your difficulties? If you are proceeding on the enemy's idea of justice and suggesting that your opportunities and intentions should be taken into account, then I am not sure that a charge of heresy does not lie against you. At any rate, you will soon find that the justice of hell is purely realistic and concerned only with results. Bring us back food, or be food yourself. The only constructive passage in your letter is where you say that you still expect good results from the patient's fatigue. That is well enough, but it won't fall into your hands. Fatigue can produce extreme gentleness and quiet of mind, and even something like vision. If you have often seen men led by it into anger, malice, and impatience, That is because those men have had efficient tempters. The paradoxical thing is that moderate fatigue is a better soil for peevishness than absolute exhaustion. This depends partly on physical causes, but partly on something else. It is not fatigue simply as such that produces the anger, but unexpected demands on a man already tired. Whatever men expect, they soon come to think they have a right to. The sense of disappointment can, with very little skill on our part, be turned into a sense of injury. It is after men have given in to the irremediable, after they have despaired of relief and ceased to think even a half hour ahead, that the dangers of humbled and gentle weariness begin. To produce the best results from the patient's fatigue, therefore, you must feed him with false hopes. Put into his mind plausible reasons for believing that the air raid will not be repeated. Keep him comforting himself with the thought of how much he will enjoy his bed next night. Exaggerate the weariness by making him think it will soon be over. For men usually feel that a strain could have been endured no longer at the very moment when it is ending, or when they think it is ending. In this, as in the problem of cowardice, the thing to avoid is the total commitment. Whatever he says, let his inner resolution be not to bear whatever comes to him, but to bear it for a reasonable period. And let the reasonable period be shorter than the trial is likely to last. It need not be much shorter. In attacks on patience, chastity, and fortitude, the fun is to make the man yield. Just when, had he but known it, relief was almost in sight. I do not know whether he is likely to meet the girl under conditions of strain or not. If he does, make full use of the fact that up to a certain point, fatigue makes women talk more and men talk less. Much secret resentment, even between lovers, can be raised from this. Probably the scenes he is now witnessing will not provide material for an intellectual attack on his faith. Your previous failures have put that out of your power. But there is a sort of attack on the emotions which can still be tried. It turns on making him feel, when first he sees human remains plastered on a wall, that this is what the world is really like, and that all his religion has been a fantasy. You will notice that we have got them completely fogged about the meaning of the word real. They tell each other of some great spiritual experience. All that really happened was that you heard some music in a lighted building. Here real means the bare physical facts, separated from the other elements, in the experience they actually had. On the other hand, they will also say, it's all very well discussing that high dive as you sit here in an armchair, but wait till you get up there and see what it's really like. Here, real is being used in the opposite sense to mean not the physical facts, which they know already while discussing the matter in armchairs, but the emotional effect those facts will have on a human consciousness. Either application of the word could be defended, but our business is to keep the two going at once, so that the emotional value of the word real can be placed now on one side of the account, now on the other, as it happens to suit us. The general rule which we have now, pretty well established among them, is that in all experiences which can make them happier or better, only the physical facts are real, while the spiritual elements are subjective. In all experiences which can discourage or corrupt them, the spiritual elements are the main reality, and to ignore them is to be an escapist. Thus in birth, the blood and pain are real, the rejoicing a mere subjective point of view, in death, the terror and ugliness reveal what death really means. The hatefulness of a hated person is real. In hatred you see men as they are. You are disillusioned. But the loveliness of a loved person is merely a subjective has concealing a real core of sexual appetite or economic suggestion. Wars and poverty are really horrible. Peace and plenty are mere physical facts about which men happen to have certain sentiments. The creatures are always accusing one another of wanting to eat the cake and have it. But thanks to our labors, they are more often in the predicament of paying for the cake and not eating it. Your patient, properly handled, will have no difficulty in regarding his emotion at the sight of human entrails as a revelation of reality, and his emotion at the sight of happy children or fair weather as mere sentiment, your affectionate uncle. My dear, my very dear, Wormwood, my poppet, my pig snake, how mistakenly, now that all is lost, you come whimpering to ask me whether the terms of affection in which I address you meant nothing from the beginning. Far from it, rest assured. My love for you and your love for me are as like as two peas. I have always desired you as you, pitiful fool, desired me. The difference is that I am the stronger. I think they will give you to me now, or a bit of you. Love you? Why, yes. As dainty a morsel as ever I grew fat on. You have let a soul slip through your fingers. The howl of sharpened famine for that loss re-echoes at this moment through all the levels of the kingdom of noise, down to the very throne itself. It makes me mad to think of it. How well I know what happened at the instant when they snatched him from you. There was a sudden clearing of his eyes, was there not, as he saw you for the first time and recognized the part you had had in him and knew that you had it no longer. Just think, and let it be the beginning of your agony, what he felt at that moment, as if a scab had fallen from an old sore, as if he were emerging from a hideous shell-like tetter, as if he shuffled off for good and all, a defiled, wet, clinging garment. By hell, it is misery enough to see them in their mortal days, taking off dirtied and uncomfortable clothes and splashing in hot water and giving little grunts of pleasure, stretching their eased limbs. What, then, of this final stripping, this complete cleansing? The more one thinks about it, the worse it becomes. He got through so easily. No gradual misgivings, no doctor's sentence, no nursing home, no operating theater, no false hopes of life. Sheer, instantaneous liberation. One moment it seemed to be all our world. The scream of bombs, the fall of houses, the stink and taste of high explosive on the lips and in the lungs, the feet burning with weariness, the heart cold with horrors, the brain reeling, the legs aching. Next moment, all this was gone. Gone like a bad dream, never again to be of any account. Defeated, outmaneuvered fool. Did you mark how naturally, as if he'd been born for it, the earth-born vermin entered the new life? How all his doubts became, in the twinkling of an eye, ridiculous. I know what the creature was saying to itself. Yes, of course. It always was like this. All horrors have followed the same course, getting worse and worse and forcing you into a kind of bottleneck till. At the very moment when you thought you must be crushed, behold, you were out of the narrows and all was suddenly well. The extraction hurt more and more, and then the tooth was out. The dream became a nightmare, and then you woke. You die, and then you are beyond death. How could I ever have doubted it? As he saw you, he also saw them. I know how it was. You reeled back dizzy and blinded, more hurt by them than he had ever been by bombs. The degradation of it, that this thing of earth and slime could stand upright and converse with spirits before whom you, a spirit, could only cower. Perhaps you had hoped that the awe and strangeness of it would dash his joy. But that is the cursed thing. The gods are strange to mortal eyes, and yet they are not strange. He had no faintest conception till that very hour of how they would look, and even doubted their existence. But when he saw them, he knew that he had always known them, and realized what part each one of them had played at many an hour in his life when he had supposed himself alone, so that now he could say to them one by one, not "Who are you?" but "So it was you all the time." All that they were and said at this meeting woke memories. The dim consciousness of friends about him, which had haunted his solitudes from infancy, was now at last explained. That central music in every pure experience, which had always just evaded memory, was now at last recovered. Recognition made him free of their company almost before the limbs of his corpse became quiet. Only you were left outside. He saw not only them, he saw him. This animal, this thing begotten in a bed, could look on him. What is blinding, suffocating fire to you is now cool light to him, is clarity itself, and wears the form of a man. You would like, if you could, to interpret the patient's prostration in the presence, his self-abhorrence, and utter knowledge of his sins, yes, wormwood, a clearer knowledge even than yours, on the analogy of your own choking and paralyzing sensations when you encounter the deadly air that breathes from the heart of heaven. But it's all nonsense. Pains he may still have to encounter, but they embrace those pains. They would not barter them for any earthly pleasure. All the delights of sense or heart or intellect with which you could once have tempted him, even the delights of virtue itself, now seem to him in comparison but as the half-nauseous attractions of a raddled harlot, would seem to a man who hears that his true beloved, whom he has loved all his life, and whom he had believed to be dead, is alive. And even now at his door, he is caught up into that world where pain and pleasure take on transfinite values, and all our arithmetic is dismayed. Once more, the inexplicable meets us. Next to the curse of useless tempters, like yourself, the greatest curse upon us is the failure of our intelligence department. If only we could find out what he is really up to. Alas, alas, that knowledge, in itself so hateful